Have you ever wondered why history sounds like it was written by men, for men? Every time we open a history book, it's the same story: kings, knights, bishops, warriors, page after page of men shaping the world. But what about the women who lived, loved, ruled, and fought beside them for more than 500 years? Where did their voices go? Here's the truth that might surprise you: medieval women were never silent. They were queens who ruled empires, warriors who led armies, and thinkers who laid the groundwork for ideas that still shape us today. But their stories? They were erased. Buried under centuries of male-dominated history that reduced them to background characters in their own lives. Today, we're breaking that silence. Because this isn't just about history, it's about power, identity, and the strength that refuse to be forgotten. For centuries, we've been told a lie, that women in the Middle Ages lived quiet, obedient lives as wives, mothers, or nuns. That they stayed home while the men built the world. But the truth? They were the world. I've spent years exploring archives, reading lost letters, and studying forgotten chronicles, and what I found completely changes how we see medieval history. These women weren't victims of their time. They were survivors. Strategists. Visionaries. They didn't just live in the shadows, they built the walls that cast them. Let's go back to the year 1000, Europe is restless. Vikings are still raiding coastlines, empires are rising and falling, and the church is tightening its grip on everything. It's a dangerous world ruled by men in armor. But behind those men were women who quietly held the strings of power. Take Theophanu, the Byzantine princess who became empress of the Holy Roman Empire. When her husband Otto II died unexpectedly, everyone expected her to step aside. She didn't. Instead, she ruled the empire, controlled armies. History tried to call her a caretaker. But she was a ruler. A force. A woman who refused to be forgotten. And she wasn't alone. Across Europe, women were mastering the art of indirect power. When men fought with swords, women fought with strategy. They used marriage like a weapon, turning alliances into empires. They ruled through diplomacy, faith, and wit. While the world praised kings for conquest, it was often women who held the keys to peace. And then there were the businesswomen, yes, businesswomen, centuries before the modern economy even existed. In towns from Paris to Florence, women ran trade routes, textile industries, and local markets. They turned wool and silk into international fortunes. They built financial networks that made them as powerful as the merchants and bankers we still read about today. But history didn't write their names, it just wrote their legacies in fabric and gold. Let's talk about Hildegard of Bingen, one of the most extraordinary minds in medieval history. She wasn't just a nun. She was a composer, a philosopher, a healer, and a scientist, at a time when women weren't even allowed to study. But she found a way. She claimed her ideas came from divine visions, and the church, unable to silence God, had to listen. Through that loophole, she revolutionized music, medicine, and theology, all while writing some of the most profound works of her era. That's not submission. That's brilliance disguised as obedience. And then there was Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman who refused to be defined by any man. Queen of France. Then Queen of England. Mother of 2 kings. She rode into crusades, commanded armies, and shaped the politics of Europe for decades. Eleanor understood something most men of her time didn't, that power unused is power lost. And she never let hers go to waste. From queens and abbesses to merchants and healers, medieval women built parallel worlds of power. Even in war, women held the line. While men marched to battle, women managed estates, defended castles, and built intelligence networks that shaped the outcomes of wars. They were the hidden generals, strategists who understood that leadership isn't about wielding a sword, it's about knowing when not to. And yet, when the history books were written, their names disappeared, edited out by those who couldn't imagine women as anything but supporting characters. But they were never supporting characters. They were the plot. They were the pulse of a civilization that would not have survived without them. For 500 years, medieval women carried the weight of kingdoms, knowledge, and faith, without the recognition they deserved. Their silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Their patience wasn't obedience. It was power waiting to be seen. And now, it's time we finally listen. Because history isn't just the story of men who ruled the world. It's the story of women who built it, quietly, fiercely, and with a strength that still echoes through every generation that followed. This is their story. 5 centuries of silence. 5 centuries of strength. And a legacy that refuses to die. The silence of medieval women wasn't emptiness, it was a language all its own. A quiet rebellion spoken through action instead of words. While kings shouted orders from their thrones, these women were building worlds beneath the noise, networks of faith, trade, and knowledge that would outlast every war and every crown. Let's travel to the convents, not the prisons of piety we imagine, but the hidden universities of their time. Behind stone walls, women gathered to study astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. They copied ancient texts, preserved the wisdom of lost civilizations, and even experimented with science when men called it heresy. These convents were buzzing with innovation, run by women who turned faith into freedom. The abbesses weren't passive. They commanded vast lands, managed armies of workers, and even minted their own coins. They had more political influence than many noblemen, and they used it. Through faith, they created space for independence. Through silence, they spoke louder than anyone expected. One of the greatest of them was Hildegard of Bingen, the Sibyl of the Rhine. Her music still echoes through cathedrals today, her letters challenged emperors and popes, and her medical writings shaped healing practices for centuries. She couldn't claim power outright, so she cloaked it in prophecy. When men ignored her, she said her visions came from God. And suddenly, they had to listen. Hildegard turned divine inspiration into intellectual revolution, and she did it all from within the very system built to contain her. But outside the cloisters, another kind of revolution was growing. In the cities of Flanders, France, and Germany, thousands of women began forming independent communities, the Beguines. They took no husbands, no vows to the church, and no orders from men. They lived by their own code, working, teaching, and helping the poor. Their homes became centers of learning, care, and industry, self-sustaining, self-ruled, and entirely run by women. By the 13th century, there were hundreds of Beguine communities across Europe. They owned property, made their own laws, and created their own small democracies, 1,000 years before anyone talked about women's rights. They weren't fighting wars or sitting on thrones, but make no mistake, this was a quiet revolution. They were proving that women could build societies, not just survive in them. And yet, their success frightened both church and state. Powerful men couldn't understand a world where women lived without needing them. So slowly, the Beguines were pushed out, accused of heresy, and written out of history. But their spirit, the courage to live free, would echo for centuries. Meanwhile, across royal courts, another form of strength was shaping Europe. Women weren't just playing the political game, they were the game. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, transformed marriage into a weapon of diplomacy. She was Queen of France, then Queen of England, and mother to two kings, Richard the Lionheart and John. But more than her titles, it was her mind that made her dangerous. She orchestrated alliances, inspired poets, and even joined the Crusades, not as a passive spectator, but as a leader with her own army of noblewomen. When chroniclers called her reckless, what they really meant was fearless. When they said ambitious, they meant powerful. Eleanor didn't ask for power. She took it, and the world had to adapt. And then there were the countless unnamed women, traders, craftswomen, and healers, who carried the medieval economy on their backs. In London, Bruges, Florence, and Venice, women dominated the textile trade. They weren't just weavers, they were entrepreneurs, inventors, and negotiators. They created global networks of commerce, managed contracts, and financed ventures that built cities. The wealth of medieval Europe was spun, stitched, and sold by their hands. But you won't find their names in the ledgers. You'll only find the traces of their genius in the thriving markets they left behind. The same silence covered their work in medicine and science. Women physicians, herbalists, and midwives kept communities alive through wars and plagues, centuries before the word doctor was ever applied to them. They developed healing practices, surgical tools, and remedies that saved lives when male doctors were too bound by theory to act. And yet, because they learned from one another instead of universities, their knowledge was dismissed as superstition. But the truth is this: they were the scientists of survival. They passed their wisdom through generations, from mother to daughter, quietly preserving the science that built the foundations of modern medicine. Every tincture, every cure, every technique they perfected was a rebellion, a refusal to stay ignorant, even when forbidden to learn. And their influence didn't stop at the household or marketplace. Medieval women reshaped the law itself. Locked out of official courts, they created their own systems of justice. They negotiated marriages like treaties, found loopholes in property laws, and became expert mediators in their communities. Some noblewomen became de facto judges, settling disputes, drafting contracts, and controlling estates with intelligence that outmatched most trained lawyers. They didn't just survive the rules. They rewrote them. Even in war, their strength was unmistakable. When husbands and sons went off to battle, women defended the castles, commanded the walls, and kept the people alive. They organized militias, rationed supplies, and coordinated strategies that often decided whether a city fell or stood. Behind every siege and every victory, there was almost always a woman holding the line. And when the world collapsed, they rebuilt it, stone by stone, family by family. Through 5 centuries of silence, they found ways to speak. Through faith, through trade, through law, through love. And though history buried their names, their strength never faded. Because strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and unstoppable. It's the woman who keeps the world standing while everyone else fights to control it. So the next time you think of the Middle Ages, don't just picture knights and kings. Picture queens in armor, scholars in convents, and merchants in marketplaces. Picture the women who dared to create a life beyond permission. They were silenced, but not erased. They were forgotten, but not defeated. And today, their voices rise again, reminding us that the story of power was never his alone. This was her world. This was her revolution. And after 500 years of silence, her strength still speaks. The silence began to break, not with a shout, but with a whisper. By the late 1400s, the world was changing. Cities were growing. Printing presses were humming. And for the first time in centuries, ideas began to travel faster than armies. Women, who had lived for generations in the shadows of cathedrals and castles, suddenly found a window opening. It was small, fragile, but enough for a spark to escape. That spark was education. When the printing press was born, books became cheaper, words became weapons, and knowledge stopped belonging to the few. Women began to read. Not just the scriptures they were allowed, but philosophy, science, and politics. Every page turned in secret was an act of rebellion. And in this quiet revolution of ink and courage, new voices emerged. One of them was Christine de Pizan, a widow who refused to vanish into silence. She picked up a pen and started to write, about women, for women. In a world where every story made women the villains or the victims, Christine built something unheard of, the City of Ladies. A place where women were the heroes of their own history. She wrote, if it were customary to send daughters to school as sons are, they would learn just as well. Those words, written over 600 years ago, became the foundation of everything modern feminism would one day stand on. She was centuries ahead of her time, a medieval mind that dreamed of equality long before the world was ready for it. And she wasn't alone. In convents and courts, noblewomen began to sponsor artists, philosophers, and musicians. They became patrons of the Renaissance before the Renaissance even had a name. Women like Isabella d'Este, called the First Lady of the World. She ruled Mantua not through conquest, but through culture, turning her court into a sanctuary for art and intellect. Painters, poets, and thinkers all gathered around her, and they listened. It was women like Isabella who shaped the birth of modern Europe, not with swords, but with vision. But beyond the palaces, another kind of power was growing, the power of resistance. In the villages and towns, women began to challenge the laws that bound them. They demanded property rights, defended their trades, and used local courts to fight for justice. Every case they won, every signature on a contract, chipped away at a system built to keep them invisible. And yet, history wasn't kind to this awakening. Because when women began to rise, fear followed. The same Europe that praised its artists and thinkers soon turned dark again, consumed by superstition and control. The witch hunts began. It was one of history's most brutal ironies. After centuries of silence, the moment women found their voices, they were punished for it. Thousands were accused, midwives, healers, scholars, the very women who had carried knowledge through the Dark Ages. Their wisdom, once sacred, was now condemned as sorcery. Their independence, seen as rebellion. And so, the flames rose once more, this time not for power, but for fear of it. But even as they burned their bodies, they couldn't kill the idea. Because ideas don't die in fire. Through pain and persecution, the strength of medieval women passed into the blood of generations that followed. The daughters of silence became the mothers of change. Every act of defiance, from a nun copying forbidden texts to a peasant woman teaching her child to read, was a thread in a much larger tapestry. And when the Renaissance finally blossomed, that tapestry covered all of Europe. Women became poets, painters, and philosophers. They stepped into the light of art and reason, carrying with them the unspoken lessons of 500 years. They had learned to survive without recognition, to lead without permission, to heal without praise. Now, they would learn to be seen. And even though the world still called them secondary, their influence was unstoppable, flowing quietly beneath the surface of history, guiding the progress of humanity itself. This was the dawn after silence, not the end of their struggle, but the beginning of something eternal. Because history is not just made by those who win wars, it's also written by those who refuse to disappear. The medieval woman didn't vanish. She evolved. From silence, she became song. From obedience, she became wisdom. And from centuries of being unseen, she became the mirror in which the world finally began to see itself. As the dawn of the Renaissance brightened Europe, the world began to remember names again. But even then, so many of the real queens were quietly erased, hidden behind the portraits of their husbands, their crowns turned into ornaments, their stories into footnotes. Yet if you look closely, you'll see them, standing tall in the margins of history. They were the women who ruled kingdoms not by force, but by intelligence. Who led armies without lifting a sword. Who understood that power wasn't about noise, it was about endurance. One such woman was Catherine de' Medici, born into one of the most powerful Italian families of her time. History painted her as ruthless, cold, even cruel. But the truth is far more complex. Catherine lived in a world where every decision a woman made was seen as manipulation. She wasn't heartless, she was strategic. A survivor in a court that devoured its own. She kept France from tearing itself apart through years of religious war, balancing power, politics, and motherhood in a way no king could have managed. She played the game better than anyone, because she had no choice. And then there was Elizabeth I of England, the woman who turned solitude into empire. She ruled for 45 years, a time when being unmarried was considered dangerous, even unnatural. But Elizabeth turned her singlehood into strength. She called herself married to England. Under her reign, the arts flourished, the seas were conquered, and a new sense of nationhood was born. Her every gesture was a performance, a calculated expression of power wrapped in grace. And behind her calm smile was a truth every powerful woman has known. That the world will forgive a man's ambition, but never a woman's. These women, queens, regents, advisors, walked through fire to hold on to power. They didn't inherit peace, they built it. Brick by brick. Law by law. Choice by choice. But not all queens wore crowns. Some wore ink on their fingers. Some wore calluses from work. Some wore the quiet dignity of mothers who raised the next generation of dreamers. In Spain, Isabella of Castile reshaped the destiny of her country, funding voyages that would alter the map of the world. In Russia, Sophia Alexeyevna ruled from behind the veil, outsmarting the boyars and keeping the throne steady. In France, Marguerite de Navarre became the heartbeat of humanist thought, blending faith, art, and reform into one voice that would echo for centuries. And through them all, the same pattern remained: the price of power was always silence. History celebrated their husbands, their sons, their generals. But their choices, their intelligence, their sheer endurance, became the unseen foundation of the modern age. The Renaissance loved to talk about reason and humanism, about the dignity of man. But it was women who carried the humanity of that world when it was still learning how to be civilized. They preserved its art, healed its people, and gave birth to its thinkers, even as the world tried to deny them the right to think. And slowly, the ripples they created began to touch the future. The Enlightenment was coming, a time of questions, of science, of freedom. And though the philosophers of that age wrote about liberty, it was the daughters of these forgotten queens who would dare to ask. If freedom belongs to all, then why not to us? The silent legacy of medieval women became the heartbeat of progress. Their courage was inherited by poets, reformers, and revolutionaries. By women who would one day demand education, rights, and equality, not as gifts, but as birthrights. Catherine, Elizabeth, Isabella, they were never just rulers. They were blueprints. They showed the world what power could look like when worn by compassion instead of cruelty. When guided by intellect instead of ego. They were proof that strength could exist without violence, and that leadership, at its purest, begins with empathy. Their thrones have turned to dust. Their portraits hang in silence. But their stories? They're still alive, in every woman who dares to lead, to create, to speak. Because every time a woman today stands her ground, negotiates her worth, or defends her voice, she is echoing them. The forgotten queens who refuse to disappear. Their crowns may have faded, but their legacy burns brighter than ever, lighting the path from the dark ages to the modern world. This was their triumph. Their quiet revolution. Their eternal strength. The world was changing, again. The quiet centuries of survival were over. Now came the age of questions. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the great philosophers of Europe filled the air with talk of liberty, equality, and the rights of man. But behind those grand speeches, a silent thought was growing, whispered in salons, painted in poetry, hidden in the letters of women who had waited too long to be heard. What about us? For centuries, women had carried civilization on their backs, raising kings, preserving art, tending to wounds, and keeping hope alive in the dark. Now, as men claimed to have discovered reason, women began to claim something even greater, justice. In Paris, in London, in Vienna, they gathered, not in parliaments or courts, but in parlors. The salons became their new battlegrounds. Here, amid candlelight and conversation, women discussed philosophy, politics, and revolution. They invited thinkers, challenged them, debated them, often with sharper wit and deeper clarity. Madame Geoffrin, Julie de Lespinasse, Madame de Staël, these were not noble ornaments. They were the intellectual architects of the Enlightenment. They opened their homes, funded scholars, and shaped the very conversations that would define modern thought. And yet, when men spoke of freedom, they forgot who taught them to think freely. Until one woman decided to remind them. Her name was Olympe de Gouges, a playwright, philosopher, and revolutionary spirit. When France erupted in 1789, and men wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Man, Olympe took her pen and rewrote it. She called it, the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. She wrote, "Woman is born free and remains equal to man in rights." A sentence so simple, yet so dangerous, that it shook the foundations of the new republic. For daring to speak equality out loud, Olympe was sent to the guillotine. But her words survived. They became the prophecy of a new world, one that would take centuries to arrive. Across the Channel in England, another voice rose, calm, brilliant, and relentless. Mary Wollstonecraft, the mother of modern feminism, published A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. She argued that women weren't inferior, they were simply uneducated, deliberately kept in ignorance. "Educate your women," she wrote. "And they will be the companions, not the toys, of men. Because history doesn't end when justice arrives. It continues, every time a woman learns, leads, creates, or simply refuses to disappear." The strength of medieval women was never just survival, it was creation. They built the foundations of knowledge, medicine, and art. They taught the world endurance. And though they were silenced, they still shaped every corner of the modern soul. Their blood runs through the present. In every scientist who dares to question. In every artist who paints her truth. In every girl who dreams of the sky and refuses to bow. 500 years of silence became 1,000 years of strength. And that strength is still growing. Because when one woman rises, she carries with her the voices of millions who never could. And when she speaks, the world finally listens. And that was the story of women who refused to vanish. 500 years of silence. 500 years of resilience. And even now, their strength still echoes in every woman who dares to dream. Because history doesn't just belong to kings and conquerors. It belongs to the healers, the builders, the mothers, the thinkers. The women who shaped the world, even when no one was watching. Their names may have been erased from the pages of history, but their power was written in the bones of our civilization. So the next time you hear someone say the Middle Ages were a man's world, remember Theophanu, Hildegard, Eleanor, and the countless others whose courage lit the way. They weren't just part of history. They were history. And their strength lives on. In me, in you, and in every voice that refuses to be silenced. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Keep their voices alive. And if you want more hidden stories of real strength and forgotten power, subscribe, because this is just the beginning.